The winter of 1853 had settled over Adams County with the kind of damp, bone-heavy cold that did not announce itself through snowfall or dramatic weather, but rather through the quiet, persistent seep of chill into wood, cloth, and flesh. The fields stretched in subdued browns and ashen greens, stiff with frost at first light and softening only slightly under the pale midday sun. The air carried the scent of damp earth, wet rope, smoke from the big house's chimneys, and something metallic beneath it all. Old iron, perhaps, or the residue of long-dried blood on tools kept serviceable for plantation routines. It was on one such morning, before the world had fully lifted the veil of gray dawn, that Caleb, a 12-year-old boy small for his age and silent far beyond it, stepped out from the doorway of the cabin where he slept along with 11 others. His bare feet pressed into the frozen dirt, and though he flinched, he did not make a sound. Sound traveled quickly in the yard at that hour, and sound was often mistaken for disobedience. The cabins formed a crooked line not far from the main house, their wood swollen from years of rains and summers, their roofs patched with whatever could be spared: tar paper, dried grass, strips of old cloth. Smoke rose thinly from a few of their chimneys, but no warmth lingered inside. The fires were banked low overnight to save what little fuel the enslaved were allowed. As Caleb stepped into the cold, he saw the familiar shapes of others already moving through the dimness. Older men bending their stiff backs as they prepared tools, women tying rags around their heads to keep out the wind, a few children like him hurrying to fall into their expected positions lest an overseer notice their delay. The stillness before sunrise was not peaceful. It was expectant, strained, as if the plantation itself held its breath before the day's machinery of labor and punishment began its grinding rotation once more. Caleb knew his place in that machinery well. He had been trained to rise before commands were spoken, to anticipate demands before they were made, and to silence his thoughts before they reached his face. The adults said little to him. Those who had children of their own often feared teaching them too much hope or too much caution, for either could bring danger. Yet Caleb, sharp-eyed and soft-footed, absorbed everything. The way the overseer, Mr. Collins, circled the yard on frosty mornings with a slow, deliberate gait, tapping the side of his boot with his riding crop not to threaten but to remind. The way the mistress's voice drifted from the open kitchen windows, brittle as icicles, remarking on the wastefulness of provisions or the unreliability of the hands. The way older enslaved men coughed into their palms and studied the ground while speaking to those above them. No one announced the rules directly, but the rules were everywhere, etched in glances, gestures, silences, and scars. That morning, as he waited for the order to move to the stables for sorting, Caleb noticed a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone but a child accustomed to reading danger in the smallest movements. The overseers were more alert than usual, their faces drawn tight against the cold but also against something else. Mr. Collins had been joined by two men whom Caleb rarely saw at dawn: Mr. Wright, who handled purchase and inventory records, and a shorter, thick-necked man known as Clem, who assisted with tracking runaways when needed. The three of them spoke in low tones near the line of tool sheds, their voices muffled but their postures tense. Caleb lowered his gaze and kept his steps careful, but as he crossed the yard carrying a wooden bucket toward the well, he caught fragments of their conversation, words his young mind understood only by the way they were spoken. South, prices rising, ways to hold on to him. Boys near grown. Happens every winter. He did not yet know they were speaking of him. The plantation hierarchy was a structure as rigid and cold as the winter ground. The master, who visited only sporadically from Natchez, delegated authority to his wife and his overseers. Beneath them were the white hired hands, then the informants among the enslaved. usually older men or women who had been coerced into reporting small infractions or murmured discontent. These informants were both feared and pitted, for whatever small measure of protection they received from the household came at the cost of their standing among their own people. Caleb did not know precisely who among the enslaved served this role, though he suspected a few. The man named Dalton, who was quiet to the point of invisibility but always seemed to drift near conversations. The woman Hester, who never worked in the fields but moved constantly between the big house and the cabins carrying unspoken authority, and young Enoch, only a few years older than Caleb but already so desperate to avoid the lash that he watched others with wide, nervous eyes. Caleb avoided them all. He lived in the spaces between attention and neglect, so insignificant in the plantation's view that he sometimes wondered if invisibility could be a kind of shield. But invisibility faltered when he drew too near to things not meant for him. That morning, after filling the bucket at the well, he passed close enough to the tool sheds to hear more clearly. "South Carolina wants stock his age. Buyer coming in 2 weeks." Not a whisper to the hands. Best keep him working with the stable boys until. He kept walking, his arms straining against the weight of the water, his face blank. But something inside him tightened, an instinctive grip of fear that did not yet have shape or explanation. He knew little about selling south, other than that those taken never returned. Adults whispered of long transport chains, harsher plantations, sugar fields, and punishments so severe they made even the lashings here seem merciful. But no one ever explained these things fully to children. They did not need to. The terror of the unknown was often enough. Later that morning, while the sun struggled to pierce the haze, Caleb found himself sweeping near the back entrance of the big house, as he sometimes did when extra hands were needed to keep the pathways clear. The kitchen door was open, letting out bursts of warm, fragrant air laced with spice and lard. Inside, the cook, an older woman named Cora, whose face was lined with deep worry, moved quickly between pots. 2 house servants whispered near the pantry, their voices sharp and nervous. Caleb kept his head low and swept carefully around the doorstep, but one of the whispered sentences drifted out clearly into the cold. "If they sell that boy, his aunt'll break. Mark my words." She near lost her mind when they took. The rest was cut short as the mistress entered, and the servants' voices snapped shut like shutters in a storm. Caleb did not lift his eyes, but the words stayed with him, settling like cold ash in his stomach. What began as unease hardened into a quiet dread by the afternoon. Caleb's routine took him to the stables, where he helped brush down the mules and collect stray bits of hay. The stable master, an older enslaved man with a limp and a scar that reached from temple to jaw, was known for his fairness but also for his silence. Today he was more silent than usual, watching Caleb with an expression that flickered between pity and restraint. At one point, while adjusting the bridle on one of the animals, he murmured just loudly enough for Caleb to hear, "Keep your head down these days." Then he turned away before Caleb could look up. But it was not that warning alone that shaped the decisive shift in Caleb's understanding. It was what came later, in the dying light of the day, when he returned to the cabins with a bundle of kindling tied in thin twine. Dalton, the suspected informant, stood beside the door of Caleb's cabin, speaking to Mr. Wright. The 2 men spoke quietly, but Dalton's face was drawn tight and pale, and he kept glancing toward the children returning from their duties. Mr. Wright nodded curtly, signed something on a folded ledger, and turned away. Dalton exhaled slowly, then hurried off in the opposite direction. Caleb could have walked past without stopping, but something, a flicker of defiance, perhaps, or a child's reckless curiosity, pulled him a step too close to the door. His foot struck a loose board, and the sound drew Mr. Wright's attention. The man's eyes narrowed as he studied Caleb. Caleb froze. For a moment the cold seemed to sharpen around them. as if the winter air itself were waiting. Then Mr. Wright spoke, each word clipped and measured. "You ought to watch where you step, boy." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight to answer, and hurried into the cabin. But the encounter was not what unsettled him most. It was the look in Mr. Wright's eyes, not angry but calculating, as though he were taking note of something he already believed inevitable. That night, the cabin was a cluster of exhausted bodies collapsing onto straw pallets and rough blankets. The fire burned low in the small hearth, casting thin light over the cramped space. Caleb lay between two younger children, listening to the adults murmur about the frost, the rations, the extra weight of winter labor. Then the conversation drifted, carefully, cautiously, to other things. A name was spoken in a whisper. A boy, a sail, a journey no one returned from. They spoke without calling Caleb's name, but the weight of their words pressed against him like the cold pressing through the cabin walls. He should have closed his eyes and willed himself to sleep. But sleep did not come. The cabin door creaked faintly with each gust of wind, and every sound, a cough, a shifting body, a distant dog bark from the yard, seemed like a sign of something approaching. The idea that he might be taken south dug into his mind with a sharp, instinctive clarity. Caleb had made mistakes before, small ones, the kind children made when curiosity tugged harder than caution. Once he had lingered too long near the smokehouse. Another time he had spoken when silence was required. But the fear that gnawed at him now was deeper than fear of punishment. It was the fear of vanishing, of being sent to a place from which he could never return, where no one knew him and no one would care if he lived or died. The next day brought the moment that would set everything in motion. It was just after dawn. Caleb had been sent to carry linens from the washing area to the line behind the big house, a task usually reserved for the older girls, but today assigned to him without explanation. The wind bit at his fingers as he lifted the damp cloth, and the ground crunched beneath his feet. As he rounded the corner behind the house, he heard voices, Mr. Collins and the mistress. He froze instantly, pressed against the wall, unseen behind a stack of wooden crates. Their conversation drifted through the sharp morning air. "Take him at the end of the month," the mistress was saying. "The buyer wants the smaller ones. Says they fetch higher prices these days." "And no one told the hands?" Mr. Collins asked. "Of course not. Must avoid trouble. You know how they get." Caleb's breath caught. His heart hammered painfully. The linen slipped slightly in his hands, and he tightened his grip to keep it from falling. Mr. Collins continued, "The boy's aunt. She suspects something?" "Likely," the mistress replied. "Keep her quiet. The last thing we need is another scene." The rest of the conversation blurred. Caleb could no longer hear clearly. His pulse drowned out the words. He forced himself to stay still until the voices faded. Then he moved with mechanical precision, hang the linens, avoid eye contact, return to the yard, keep his head down. But inside him, something irrevocable had changed. That night, Caleb committed the small forbidden act that would lead, step by step, toward escape. The cabins were quiet, most of the adults already asleep. Caleb slipped out into the cold carrying nothing but a thin cloth around his shoulders. He moved behind the cabins, past the shed, past the boundary where the yard lamps cast faint circles of yellow light. There, near the edge of the woods, lay the old trapping ditch, long and used, filled with sticks and debris. Caleb had never been allowed this far alone, but he stepped closer, drawn by the need to see the world beyond the yard, to understand the space he might soon be forced into. He crouched beside the ditch, reaching out to touch the frozen earth. It was just soil, roots, and cold air, but it felt like the edge of a possible future, terrible and vast. A twig snapped behind him. Caleb jerked around, but no overseer stood there. Only Enoch, the nervous boy informant, watched him from a distance, his eyes wide with confusion and something like fear. "You shouldn't be out here," Enoch whispered. Caleb said nothing. Enoch hesitated, then backed away. "I ain't saying nothing. Just go back before someone sees." But someone had seen. Not Enoch. The cold itself, the darkness, the plantation's unblinking order. Something had shifted tonight. Caleb felt it in his bones. He had stepped too close to the boundary, and in doing so had made it impossible to remain still. The world around him tightened like a noose, and he understood, without being told, that if he did nothing, he would be taken. That realization, silent, heavy, and inevitable, was the true beginning. Tomorrow, or the next day, or the one after that, he would run. The frost thickened on the ground. The wind rose. And somewhere deep within the winter-dark woods, a path waited for him, already listening. The days following Caleb's quiet, forbidden venture to the edge of the woods unfolded like a tightening snare, slow at first, almost imperceptible to those who did not live in constant fear, but unmistakable to a child who had learned to read danger in shadows and stray glances. The winter air sharpened with each sunrise, and the plantation's routines became brittle, as though a single wrong movement might crack them and reveal something dark beneath. Caleb moved through these days with a careful, practiced stillness, yet an inner current tugged him forward, urging him to prepare, to watch, to gather what little knowledge he could before the moment came when he would no longer have the luxury of hesitation. He could not name the exact day when he began planning. It was not a plan in any formal sense. No maps, no provisions, no guidance beyond instinct and scattered rumors whispered by those who remembered distant escapes or had heard of others attempting the impossible. But something had taken root inside him. The knowledge that staying meant vanishing into the long chain of bodies sold farther south, swallowed by fields even more merciless than those here. That thought did not leave him, not even when he tried to push it aside in the interest of survival. The overseers sensed it too, not Caleb's intent, for he was careful to show nothing, but a shift in the air, a restlessness among the enslaved that could not be easily explained. Mr. Collins twice increased patrols at dusk, though he gave no reason. Clem, the thick-necked man, lingered near the cabins more frequently, chewing on bits of straw and watching the yard with narrowed eyes. Even Dalton, always quiet and watchful, seemed tense as he moved between tasks, occasionally glancing at Caleb with an expression Caleb could not quite decipher. Was it sympathy, suspicion, or something else entirely? Whispers began to drift through the cabins at night, muted and feverish. Some spoke of the upcoming sale, the buyer from Carolina, they called him, and others spoke of the possibility of warning Caleb's aunt, who had grown increasingly withdrawn in the days since the news had reached her somehow. But no one spoke openly in front of the boy. A child, they believed, was fragile. Too much truth might shatter him. They did not understand that Caleb had already heard enough to alter the course of his life. There were small signs the adults noticed but pretended not to see. One morning, when Caleb lingered too long near the storage shed while waiting for instructions, one of the older women coughed sharply, as if to draw his attention away from the door he was studying. Another evening, his aunt's trembling hand rested heavily on his shoulder as she handed him a scrap of cornbread from her meager portion, a gesture forbidden and dangerous for them both. She did not speak. She did not need to. The tremor in her hand told him everything. But fear was not enough to move him. It was the steady accumulation of small incidents, gestures, warnings, overheard fragments, that created the urgency. The first of these occurred 4 days after he overheard the mistress speaking behind the house. Caleb had been assigned to carry feed to the mules earlier than usual, before the frost had fully thawed from the stable floor. The stable master watched him closely that morning, his limp more pronounced in the cold. After Caleb emptied the sack into the trough, the man stepped closer and reached down to adjust the bridle on the nearest mule. His voice was low, roughened by years of labor. "You keep watch on the night sky," he murmured without looking at Caleb. "There's direction there if you know it." Caleb stiffened. "Sir." But the man did not speak again. He returned to his quiet tasks, back bent, face unreadable. Caleb understood enough to know the stable master had taken a risk by saying anything at all. The North Star. He had heard older boys whisper about it once, years ago, before an overseer overheard them and silence fell like a stone. The children had been punished, though lightly compared to others, but the message had been clear. Knowledge that could lead someone northward was dangerous. That night, Caleb stared up at the cold, glittering sky through a crack in the cabin wall. He did not know which star was the one he needed, but he knew enough to begin learning. 2 days later, he acquired the first thing he would need if he ever tried to run: food. Not much, just a small piece of dried apple overlooked in the pantry near the big house. The opportunity appeared suddenly, a gap in supervision caused by a scuffle in the kitchen when one of the mistress's glass jars slipped from a servant's hands and shattered across the floor. The noise drew all eyes. Caleb, sweeping near the pantry door, spotted the lone dried slice lying abandoned beneath the lowest shelf. His heart thudded. His hand moved before doubt could stop it, sliding the apple into the pocket of his torn shirt. It was the smallest act of theft, barely enough to sustain him for half a day. Yet to Caleb, it was monumental. It was the first tangible piece of a future that had not yet fully formed. The guilt arrived almost immediately. That evening, sitting quietly near the cabin hearth, he felt the weight of the apple slice like a stone against his ribs. Others needed food more than he did. Children cried from hunger. Elders grew gaunt in winter. Who was he to take something meant for no one, but stolen all the same? His aunt watched him closely that night, though she said nothing. She saw his discomfort, his distant eyes, the way he kept one hand pressed unconsciously against his side. She understood more than he realized, but still she said nothing, perhaps fearing that any words might push him toward a fate she could not bear. But the guilt was soon overshadowed by the growing sense of danger around him. The overseer's suspicion deepened, though none could identify its source. The dogs were exercised twice daily instead of once. Torch sconces near the yard perimeter were repaired for more reliable nighttime patrols. A whisper of unease passed through the enslaved workers, like a shiver of wind through dry grass. Something was coming, though no one yet knew what shape it would take. One evening, as Caleb carried a bundle of kindling back to the cabins, he heard shouting near the far corner of the yard. He froze as an overseer dragged a young man, Samuel, barely older than Caleb, into the open light. Clem followed behind them, holding Samuel's arm twisted painfully behind his back. Samuel's face was bloodied, though not severely. He trembled but stood upright, his jaw clenched. "Caught him wandering where he shouldn't," Clem growled. "Behind the smokehouse." The word struck Caleb like a blow. He himself had been near that same spot only days before, listening for overheard scraps of conversation. Fear surged through him. Had Samuel seen him? Had someone mistaken Samuel for him? Or had Samuel been searching for something entirely unrelated, unlucky enough to draw the overseer's attention now that they were on edge? The punishment was quick, brief, and brutal enough to send a message. Not a full lashing, not something that might prevent Samuel from working the next morning, but a deliberate display of authority. Clem's fist, Mr. Collins' boot, a series of shouted commands and forced apologies. The adults in the yard watched silently. The children looked away. The cruelty was not in the severity, but in the pointedness of the act, the way it reminded every pair of eyes that the overseers would not tolerate uncertainty. Caleb's heart pounded as he slipped into the shadows behind the cabins. Samuel's punishment was not his fault, yet guilt gnawed at him all the same. If Samuel had been searching for something, food, warmth, a moment of solitude, Caleb's own secret movements had made such wandering dangerous. If Samuel had been mistaken for him, the weight of that error pressed on Caleb's conscience like a hand on his throat. That night, Caleb barely slept. His mind raced through possibilities. Who had seen him near the woods? Had Enoch spoken? Had Dalton whispered something he should not have? Or had the overseers simply sensed that the oppressive calm of the plantation had shifted in ways they did not yet understand? The uncertainty made everything sharper, more urgent. 3 days later, the near betrayal occurred. Caleb had been sent to carry firewood to the big house, his steps careful on the icy path. As he approached the entrance, he saw Enoch standing near the back porch, speaking in low, hurried tones to Mr. Wright. Enoch's eyes darted nervously, and his hands twisted together. Caleb slowed, instinct guiding him rather than thought. He could not hear Enoch's words, but he recognized the tone, frantic, desperate, pleading for favor. Mr. Wright listened with an expression of cool disinterest, glancing occasionally toward the yard. Then Enoch pointed, not at Caleb specifically, but toward the general cluster of cabins. Yet the gesture was enough. Caleb felt cold seep inward from the center of his chest, not from the winter, but from something much more dangerous. He stepped behind a wooden barrel, remaining perfectly still. Mr. Wright said something curt, dismissive. Enoch flinched, nodded, and retreated. The overseer turned away, but Caleb knew the moment had been close, too close. He understood then that Enoch, whether intentionally or out of fear, might expose him at any moment. The boy informant was unpredictable, a creature of survival whose loyalty shifted with the winds of danger. Caleb returned to his duties without drawing attention, but a decision formed in him that day, as quietly and certainly as frost forming on the ground. He could no longer rely on invisibility alone. Someone would betray him, or someone would mistake another for him, or the overseers would uncover enough hints to take him away before he had a chance to flee. And yet the guilt persisted. Escape meant risk, not just for himself, but for anyone who looked at him with kindness or pity or desperate hope. The stable master, his aunt, even the quiet adults who pretended not to notice when he lingered too long near certain places. Their lives could be destroyed by his attempt. The weight of that knowledge settled on his small shoulders like an iron yoke. But every time he imagined staying, he saw the buyers' faces, unfamiliar, cold, calculating. He saw the ledgers with names crossed out and new destinations inked in neat lines. He saw Samuel's punishment. He heard the mistress's words, "Take him at the end of the month." And he remembered his aunt's trembling hand. By the second week, the tension on the plantation had grown thick enough that even the overseers seemed uneasy. Mr. Collins checked the workshop locks twice each night. The dogs were restless, pacing in circles, noses high. Clem complained loudly that something's stirring in the cabins. And Mr. Wright carried his ledger everywhere, updating records with unusual urgency. Among the enslaved, whispers spread in fragmented, dangerous threads. Someone's leaving, he's just a child. Lord help him if they catch him. Don't speak of it. Not here. Caleb spoke to no one, but he listened to everything. He learned when the patrollers passed the far boundary road, shortly after dusk, then again near midnight. He learned that one of the torches near the west side of the yard did not always stay lit when the wind rose. He learned that the dogs were fed heavily at dawn and were least attentive in the late afternoon. He learned which paths through the woods had enough undergrowth to muffle footsteps, and which were too open. These were fragments, scattered pieces of a puzzle he did not yet know how to assemble, but he gathered them all the same. The final turning point came at the end of the 2 weeks. Caleb had gone to draw water from the well behind the cabins. The sun hung low in the sky, casting cold amber light across the yard. As he bent over the bucket, a shadow fell across the ground beside him. He looked up to see Dalton watching him, the man's face unreadable. "You've been wandering too much," Dalton said quietly. Caleb's throat tightened. "I ain't." Dalton shook his head slowly. "It don't matter what you do. It matters what they think you do. And they think something." Caleb held his breath. Dalton stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper that barely stirred the air. "If you're gonna do something foolish, you best do it soon. Before they lock you in the smokehouse for safe keeping till the buyer comes." The blood drained from Caleb's face. Dalton stepped back, his expression cold again. Whether from fear or resignation, Caleb could not tell. That night, Caleb lay awake long after the fire dimmed. The others slept in uneasy fits, their breaths rising and falling in the cramped dark. Caleb kept one hand against his pocket, where the dried apple still rested. He felt the truth settling over him like the final layer of frost before morning. He could no longer wait. The moment of escape, terrifying, necessary, inevitable, had begun its slow approach. And somewhere beyond the yard, in the cold stillness of the woods, the path he had only glimpsed now waited with open, silent breath. The night Caleb slipped away began without omen, without storm, without the usual commotion that signaled trouble on the plantation. It was the quiet that betrayed the truth, the unusual, heavy quiet of a winter sky pressing low over Adams County, a quiet so complete that footsteps seemed swallowed before they touched the ground. Caleb had never known a silence like that. It felt as though the world itself had paused to see whether he would truly go through with the decision that had been growing inside him like a bruise, deepening day by day until it throbbed with a pain that could no longer be ignored. He did not run at first. He simply walked, slipping between the cabins with a deliberate stillness that made him feel older than 12, older than the trees that stood around the quarters like motionless sentinels. He carried nothing but the memory of whispered directions and the warmth of a piece of cornbread still hidden under his shirt, wrapped in cloth stolen from a laundry line. Behind him the plantation slept, or pretended to. He felt certain that some eyes must be watching him from between the cracks of the cabin walls, eyes of those who had known he was planning something, though none had dared say it aloud. If they saw him leave, they said nothing. Silence was its own form of mercy. By dawn his absence was noticed. By noon the alarm had spread beyond the quarters, rippling outward like a stone thrown into still water. The first to shout was a young overseer whose pride was always greater than his sense. He stormed through the yards bellowing Caleb's name as though the boy might answer him out of habit. When the echo came back empty, he grew red with indignation, kicking at the frozen mud, cursing the ungrateful brat. It did not occur to him that the boy might already be miles away, that a child could move through the woods with the caution of a creature raised under constant threat. By midday the slave catchers had begun to gather. 17 in all, though not at once. They arrived in pairs and trios, some on horseback, some with dogs, all with the hardened expressions of men who believed the world owed them obedience. They came because it was expected of them, because the law demanded it, because the plantation owner's money was good, and because the chance to unleash controlled violence made them feel powerful in a way nothing else could. They came with thick coats smelling of tobacco smoke, with boots caked in old mud, with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, as though hunting a 12-year-old boy were no different from hunting a fox. Caleb, by then, was deep in the woods, moving with a quietness learned from years of trying not to be heard. He pressed his cold hands against the bark of a dead pine to steady himself, listening to the distant echo of dogs. The air smelled of frost and rotting leaves. He tried not to breathe too loudly. He tried not to think of how quickly the sound of barking carried through the trees. In the catcher's encampment, tempers were already fraying. One man insisted the boy must have help. Another argued that a child could not get far in such weather on his own. A third spat into the dirt and muttered that runaway youths were the worst kind, too small to track easily, too foolish to fear death, too desperate to surrender. They circled around a crude map scratched in the mud with a rifle barrel, debating which direction the child might take. None agreed. Each believed his insight superior to the next. What united them was only the certainty that Caleb must be found quickly, before he embarrassed them further by proving how ineffective they were. Meanwhile, Caleb wandered deeper into the brush, guided only by scraps of advice whispered in the kitchens, the fields, the night. Follow the low ridge until the sycamore with the split trunk, then turn toward the creek. Stay near water, but not too close. Climb only where the ground grows soft. Avoid paths where horses travel. The instructions had come from different people, though none had said explicitly why. Such conversations had to be disguised as nothing, idle talk, gossip, muttered observations about weather or hunting. But layered within them had been hints, warnings, directions meant for a child they could not openly protect. Caleb followed them all. The dogs came closer by the hour. Their growls reverberated through the cold air, accompanied by the creaking of saddle leather and the murmur of men arguing about tracks they half fabricated from wishful thinking. Caleb had learned to read footprints long before he had learned to read letters. He understood where the earth gave easily, where it held impressions, where it swallowed them whole. He stepped onto roots whenever possible, balancing carefully. He doubled back twice. He walked through a shallow bend of the creek until his legs burned from the cold. He left misleading tracks in a patch of sand by dragging a branch behind him. He spent hours moving with painstaking caution, resisting every urge to run. And still the hunters came. On the second night the dogs caught his scent. Their howls tore through the woods like something alive. Caleb froze, crouching behind the skeleton of a fallen tree. Torches flickered in the darkness, small flames bobbing in the cold wind, bending under the weight of rain that was beginning to fall. He pressed himself into the hollow beneath the trunk, barely wide enough for him to fit. Mud smeared his clothing. Water dripped onto his neck. The sound of boots crunching in the leaves was so close he could see the reflection of fire on wet bark. "Boys near," one man growled. "Too near," another muttered. "He's playing tricks." Thunder rumbled. The dogs lunged toward the hollow. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. One wrong move, and they would drag him into the open. But a burst of rain extinguished one of the torches. Men swore and stumbled. The dogs hesitated, confused by the sudden downpour and by the boy's scent now mingled with wet bark. By the time they regrouped, the wind had shifted, scattering the scent. A moment later they moved on. Caleb waited until the last echo of the dogs faded. Then he crawled out, his limbs stiff with fear and cold. He wanted to cry, but he didn't. Crying made sound. Sound meant death. Back at the plantation, tensions had reached a breaking point. Every hour Caleb remained missing intensified pressure on those who had even the faintest connection to him. Overseers demanded answers. The owner's wife whispered accusations into her husband's ear, her voice sharpened by panic and humiliation. Rumors multiplied. Someone had seen Caleb speaking to the field hand Isaiah. Someone else had noticed the cook giving him extra food. The stable boy had reported that a handful of oats had gone missing. None of these details were certain, but certainty was not required to justify punishment. Fear made everyone a suspect. Isaiah was the first to be interrogated. He denied everything, not because he wished the boy ill, but because admitting the truth would doom them both. He had helped Caleb once, months earlier, by pointing out which path patrollers rarely used. He had expected nothing to come of it. Now his silence felt like both protection and betrayal. He prayed the boy had the sense to keep moving. The catchers, meanwhile, had grown agitated by their lack of progress. They had expected the pursuit to be over by now. The fact that it wasn't made them restless and angry. One man accused another of mishandling the dogs. Another claimed the boy had supernatural help. The more superstitious muttered about signs. Owls calling at the wrong hour, tracks vanishing without explanation. The way the wind seemed to change direction every time they neared a promising lead. Their frustration turned inward, clawing at the fragile hierarchy that normally kept them aligned. They were hunters, yes, but also men ruled by pride and ego, each unwilling to admit he could be outwitted by a child. Caleb knew none of this. He only knew that he had survived 2 days more than most runaways his age. He moved through the woods with increasing confidence, but also increasing hunger. The cornbread had long been eaten. His fingers felt numb. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts that condensed into frigid air. He tried to remember the direction Isaiah had once pointed out. Follow the creek till you see the sycamore that splits like two praying hands. After that, head toward the ridgeline. There's an old trapping cabin there. Ain't used in years. He found it on the third day, a collapsed structure, leaning like a broken rib against the hillside. Inside he found remnants of an old fire pit and a rusted trap. He huddled there for several hours, listening to distant gunshots fired into the air to test for reaction. He did not flinch, though his body trembled uncontrollably. When night fell, he moved on. The next day brought the first true test of the catchers' organization. They had divided into smaller groups to cover more ground, but splitting their forces only created confusion. One group claimed to have found fresh tracks. Another insisted the prints were days old. They shouted across the woods, accusing each other of incompetence. The dogs tangled their leashes. A rider slipped in the mud and injured his leg, sparking another argument. Even the plantation owner, who had joined the search out of wounded pride, found himself cursing the men he had hired. The disarray worked in Caleb's favor. But near sunset on the fourth day came the closest call yet. He had stopped by the creek to drink, cupping icy water in his shaking palms, when the sudden crack of branches sent him scrambling. Before he could hide, a torchlight swept across the creek, illuminating his small form for the briefest instant. A shout followed, sharp, triumphant, vicious. Dogs lunged toward him, splashing into the water. Caleb ran. The world became a frenzy of branches, shadows, freezing wind. He sprinted up the creek bank, slipping, falling, scrambling up again. The dogs gained on him. He could hear their snarls, the crash of hooves behind them, the crashing of men too heavy to run with stealth. He glanced once over his shoulder and saw a torchlight reflecting on water. The sight ignited something in him, not terror, but a clarity born of desperation. He darted up a narrow deer path and vanished into a thicket where the horses could not easily follow. He dropped to the ground, sliding under a fallen branch and rolling into a hollow depression he had not even noticed. The dogs reached the thicket seconds later, but the path curved sharply, disguising his trail. They barked in confusion before one catcher cursed and yanked them back toward the creek. Caleb stayed hidden until long after their voices faded. He lay there listening to the wind, to the hiss of distant rain, to the beating of his own heart. He felt the guilt then, sharp, unexpected. Each misdirection, each trick he used, each delay he caused meant someone else might pay the price. But what choice did he have? In a world designed to crush him, survival itself was an act of rebellion. On the plantation, the atmosphere thickened with dread. The owner's wife insisted someone was helping the boy. The owner agreed. Overseers lined the enslaved in rows, demanding to know who had spoken to Caleb last, who had given him food, who had seen him leave. I stared straight ahead. No one answered. Fear and solidarity wove together, forming a fragile shield. And elsewhere, miles away, Caleb crawled deeper into the woods, exhausted but alive, moving with the ghost-like stillness of someone who had been hunted so long he no longer knew any other way to breathe. The cold rose before the light did, thick, damp, smelling of wet bark and old rot. The forest felt tight, as if it were folding inward, squeezing sound into slow, heavy pulses. Even so, Caleb could hear the dogs. Their bark came ragged now, torn at the edges, exhausted but still obedient to the men behind them. He lay flat against the soaked earth beneath a fallen trunk, his palms sunk into mud, his fingers trembling, but his body still answering him. Dawn was somewhere above the treetops, but none of its light reached the trench where he hid. That darkness was his only shield, and he knew it wouldn't last. The hunters were close. Close enough that Caleb could hear not just their steps, but their pauses, that tight silence that lives between men who no longer trust each other. 17 slave catchers. 17 men who had spent a week chasing a child. Their boots crushed the frost in uneven, frustrated rhythms. Their breath steamed in broken clouds. Their gun locks clicked compulsively, fingers checking them again and again. Avery led the front line, older, broad-shouldered, his lantern swinging low enough that it nearly brushed the moss. He looked half-demented with lack of sleep, muttering to himself as he swept the ground. Behind him trailed the others, some shivering, some cursing under their breath, all trying not to acknowledge the humiliation gathering in the cold air. The dogs had lost the trail twice before dawn. Caleb's trick near the creek, submerging himself in freezing water, crawling out through a knot of tangled roots, had cost him skin, warmth, and blood. But it bought him hours. Hours that the hunters could not afford. Now, as their barking faded again, Caleb lifted his head. His heartbeat thudded against the leaves. He could almost hear it, feel it, pressed against the frozen ground. Then a voice broke through the quiet. "He's here somewhere. He's watching us. I can feel it." Henley, youngest of the catchers, meanest, most reckless. He'd beaten a man nearly unconscious just for hesitating during questioning. Now he shook so badly that his lantern jittered against his coat. He wasn't afraid of the forest. He was afraid of being outsmarted. Caleb closed his eyes. He needed silence, inside himself, inside the world, just long enough to think. But the forest offered none. The hunters split up again, forming 3 groups, 2 circling wide around the ridge, 1 moving straight down the stream bed. Caleb knew this pattern now. He'd learned it the hard way. And he knew the one advantage still in his favor, the old trap pit just over the rise. He crawled from beneath the trunk, limbs aching, and slipped into the shadow of the brush. He moved quickly but low, his fingers scraping frozen dirt. Every inch of his body screamed for rest. But rest meant being found. Above him, branches snapped. "Avery, hold up!" Tracks split again. They split because someone keeps stomping all over the damn ground. "Me? You said." "I said follow the trail, not ruin it." Then a shove, a grunt, a scuffle. The forest exploded with the angry whine of dogs picking up the tension. Their chaos bought him seconds. He reached the trap pit, a narrow, deep hole covered in rotten planks, and crept to the right. His plan wasn't to fall in. His plan was simpler. Leave just enough disturbance to make it look like he had. Caleb pressed his toes lightly into the weakened edge. The boards groaned. Then, using the slope for leverage, he launched himself sideways, tumbling down the ravine just as the planks collapsed with a violent crack. The sound echoed through the woods like a gunshot. Within moments, he fell. "Over here. Get the lantern down. Careful, don't lean too close." But when they peered inside, they saw only darkness. No body, no movement, no boy. And suddenly the accusation tore loose. Someone told him where the pit was. Who? Who among us? Someone helped him. Caleb listened from the ravine below as 17 men began to suspect each other more than the child they hunted. The air changed, sharper, more hostile. A kind of panic that had nothing to do with him. He crawled onward, deeper between the vines, pushing through thorns that tore at his arms. His breath came in short bursts. He felt himself weakening. But then, a quiet step. Too close. Too controlled. He froze. A silhouette stood just above the ravine. One man. No lantern. No dogs. Someone who had slipped away from the others deliberately. Caleb held his breath until his chest burned. The man spoke, low and steady. I didn't see you. Understand. Caleb didn't move. If you head north, the man continued, nodding to the darker ridge, there's an old mill. Ruined. Half a mile. Beyond it, brush thick enough the dogs won't track well. A pause. Go there. That's all I'll say. Caleb still didn't answer. The man added only one more line. I didn't see you, and stepped back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. For a long moment Caleb didn't move. Then the cold reminded him he didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Voices rose again in the distance, angrier now. Avery shouting about betrayal. Someone swearing they'd root out whoever was helping the boy. Boots thudded. Metal clattered. The dogs howled. Caleb forced himself to climb the ridge. But before he reached the top, a branch snapped sharply. Too sharply. He turned, and there was Henley, alone, eyes wild, breath steaming in violent bursts. Henley saw him, and Caleb understood, instantly, without words. The man was too ashamed, too desperate, too bruised in pride to take him alive. Henley raised his rifle, hands shaking so hard the barrel wavered. Don't run, just. But Caleb was already leaping sideways. The gunshot cracked like lightning. A burst of heat grazed his neck. Then Henley screamed, a furious, broken sound, and charged after him, slipping, clawing, stumbling through thorns. The forest became a blur of motion, branches slashing Caleb's face, mud sliding beneath his feet, the ground dropping away and rising again. Behind him, shouts tangled in the air, multiple voices now, overlapping, contradicting, none in control. A shot. Another. Wild. Blind. They weren't aiming anymore. They were reacting. Caleb burst onto a narrow path where the earth felt firmer. His vision swam from cold and exhaustion. But ahead, dark against darker, he saw it. A crooked structure. Tall. Leaning. Silent. The old mill. Its doorway gaped like a throat, black and wet with mildew. The roof sagged. One wheel hung cracked, half buried in vines. He stumbled toward it. Behind him, the forest filled with the thunder of pursuit. Men tripping over each other, shouting, cursing, blaming, terrified of being the one who failed last. But Caleb kept running. Toward the mill. Toward the dark. Toward whatever came next. He didn't know if the stranger had told him the truth. But he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The forest slowly returned to its habitual silence, though the echoes of the pursuit lingered like ghosts in the brittle air. Where the ground had been trampled, the frost began to reclaim itself, softening the impressions of hurried boots and muddied tracks. The old mill remained where Caleb had reached it, leaning and rotting, a silent witness to the boy's final flight through the forest. Beyond it, the trees and underbrush closed over the traces he had left, swallowing them in shadow and decay. And yet, for those who had chased him, the memory was vivid, impossible to forget. Caleb himself was gone. For days, he moved quietly along hidden paths, avoiding settlements and patrols, surviving on what he could find in the frozen woods, berries, roots, and the thin, sharp water of winter streams. Each night, he shivered beneath scraps of bark and leaf, his body raw from cold and exhaustion, but his mind sharpened, alert, calculating. He had survived by wit and instinct, and the weight of that survival pressed upon him. Every step forward was a step taken at the expense of those who might have been caught in his absence, every choice an unspoken risk for anyone who had aided him. On the plantation, the aftermath unfolded like a slow and bitter sickness. Avery, Henley, and the remaining hunters returned, faces pale and taut with humiliation, to recount a pursuit that had ended in failure. Letters were sent north, testimony recorded in sparse, cold language, each word attempting to assign blame without acknowledging the sheer impossibility of the task. Rumors spread among the enslaved. Whispers of a boy who outwitted 17 men in 7 days, of a shadow that moved faster than dogs and rifles. Some spoke with awe, some with fear. And still, those who had quietly helped, passing directions, offering food, or looking the other way, remained unspoken heroes, their names unrecorded, their risks hidden beneath the daily necessities of obedience. Among the overseers, guilt fermented like ice beneath the skin. Some tried to write reports that blamed the boy for being clever, for exploiting gaps in routine, for being unnaturally cunning. Others wrote nothing, fearing that any admission might bring consequences not only for themselves, but for others. The plantation owners, too, felt the sting of impotent authority, their laws and codes of property rendered meaningless by a single child's ingenuity. Yet the law was invoked anyway, letters sent, threats made, but Caleb was already beyond their reach. In the weeks that followed, small decisions rippled outward with disproportionate weight. One man, found hiding a scrap of the boy's belongings, was disciplined quietly, a warning to others. Another claimed to have seen him flee into the North Woods, a statement simultaneously true and false, for it obscured the boy's continued path through winter wilderness. A letter was intercepted, never sent, that would have revealed the identities of those who aided him. Silence became a weapon as much as speech. And in every action, moral ambiguity lingered. To hide, to speak, to lie, to protect, to punish. Each choice bore the invisible burden of complicity and conscience. The winter drew on, pale and indifferent. The forests and fields of Adams County became quiet again, the frost crisp on the frozen earth, the smoke from chimneys curling into the gray sky. But the story of the fugitive child persisted, carried in whispers and letters, in the half-truths recorded in journals, and in the fearful awe of those who had witnessed or participated in the events. It became a tale of survival that was both celebrated and condemned, impossible to reconcile fully with the system that produced it. Caleb's survival, though, remained solitary, a testament to the power of cunning, endurance, and the refusal to yield to the brutality of his world. And yet, in the quiet hours, even he felt the weight of what he had left behind. The friends who might have suffered for him, the adults whose choices had been forced by circumstance, the hunters whose pride and fury had been undone by a child. Each of them was trapped in their own moral reckoning, even as the snow erased tracks and softened the forest floor. The story of those 7 days became legend in hushed tones, but it was also recorded in the minutiae of documents, letters, and recollections that survived in fragmentary form. Historians would later piece together accounts of the chase, of the ingenuity and courage of the boy, and of the panic and disarray among those who were supposed to be in control. They would debate questions of justice, morality, and human cruelty. And yet the essential question remained unresolved, haunting the margins of every telling. What does a child owe to survival when the world denies him the right to exist? For the audience of history, the question lingers without answer. There is no neat justice, no moral absolution. There is only the record, the letters, the journals, the whispered tales, and the cold winter landscape, unchanged but for the fleeting passage of a small boy who refused to be caught. In the end, it is left to those who remember, who read, who bear witness, to consider. When cruelty is built into the rules of the world, when law and custom deny humanity itself, what does survival cost? And who is accountable for the choices we make? The snow falls silently on the mill, on the tracks long since erased, on the twisted limbs of the forest that bore witness. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Caleb moves still, unseen, unbroken, and alive.